But Russia plans to cut dollar holdings in wealth fund to zero. What is the symbolism of Russia says we don't want dollars?
Back in 1917, you could buy 10 bottles of beer, 10 movie tickets, and fill your gas tank with no more than $100. Today, as you probably know from experience, $100 won't take you very far, and you would be lucky if you could make any meaningful purchases with it. To make matters worse, the job market is now more competitive than ever, and young people with dozens of qualifications are struggling to land an entry-level job to repay their insurmountable student loans. While back in 1917, you would be hired as long as you had a pulse. Unfortunately, this isn't due to a coincidence or a string of bad luck, but instead, everything has to do with the weakening of the dollar. And the bad news is, everything is about to get worse for the economy, and those who don't prepare for what's coming will certainly be left behind. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before you can understand how the US dollar is about to become ancient history and why things will get worse for the average American, you must first understand how it became the dominant currency in the world, and also why the conditions that allowed it to happen no longer exist. Luckily for you, that's exactly what we will be talking about in this video, so stay tuned. The story goes way back to 1944. At the time, World War II was still going on, but since the D-Day invasion had already happened and Nazi Germany was being crushed on both fronts, Allied victory seemed to be only a matter of time. And since most of the once strong and prosperous European economies were in ruins, the world's balance of power shifted for the first time from Europe to America. Because of that, Allied leaders decided to meet in Bretton Woods in order to devise a new economic order for the after-war years. Luckily for the US, it was one of the few developed nations that prospered during the war years, since they now held most of the world's gold reserves and went practically unharmed by it. At the conference, which later became known as the Bretton Woods Conference, Allied leaders decided that most of the world's currencies would be linked to the US dollar, while the US dollar itself would be pegged to gold, and, most importantly, that all international trades must happen in US dollar. Now, to the layperson, this may seem like nothing but a minor contrivance, but in reality, this was brilliant. After all, if all of the world's international trades were to be made in US dollars, the United States would have unparalleled economic influence over any other country. Allow me to explain. Let's say Great Britain wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. Instead of paying in British pounds or in Saudi riyal, Britain will first have to trade its pounds to US dollars and then buy the oil from Saudi Arabia. The problem is that the US is the only country in the world that can legally print US dollars. And so the US government can just as easily print the money to buy everything it wants to, while all other countries have to actually work to produce goods and services in order to buy what they need. What's more, since everybody needs US dollars to make international trades, there is near limitless demand for the US dollar, and the US central bank can create extraordinary amounts of treasury bills. After all, no matter how much they print, there will still be someone out there that is in dire need of those dollars. Because of this, the purchasing power of the average American citizen instantly skyrocketed. Since now the entire US economy could be driven mostly by debt, instead of work and production like the rest of the world. This, once again, allowed the US to print as many dollars as it wanted to, while all other countries in the world have to work hard to maintain the health of their economies. As you can probably tell already, printing and lending money to the rest of the world while not having to produce anything in return might seem like a dream come true. So much so that it allowed the US to be the richest country in the world for decades on end, to have one of the higher standards of living in the world, to control by proxy most of the world's oil supply, and even wage endless wars on faraway countries. But make no mistake, this is a recipe for disaster in the long run. And there are currently several threats to the dominance of the US dollar. The first threat being China's jaw-dropping growth. For instance, China recently toppled the US to become the country that produces most goods and services in the world. This overblown production has fueled China's economy and allowed it to grow 10% annually for close to a decade, a pace that the US simply can't keep up with. On top of that, China is the third largest importer in the world as of right now. So do not be surprised when Chinese products overflood the market and the Chinese government starts accepting its own currency in international trades. Now, another threat to the US dollar's dominance is the fact that the US government owes insurmountable amounts of money to private institutions, investors, and foreign governments. For instance, the US government now owes more than $29 trillion. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, let me say that again. The US government owes more than $29 trillion. That's more than 120% of the GDP. And if we are being honest with one another, it looks like all of this debt is way past the point of no return, and it won't be repaid at all. To make matters worse, money printing and financial stimulus only increase the US government debt burden. So, all in all, things are only getting worse, and any unforeseen crisis could be enough to bring down this entire house of cards. Now, as with anything related to money and investments, there are no guarantees, so nobody can say for sure if and when the US dollar will come to pass. But some countries, especially China and Russia, have been on a gold buying spree in the last couple of years, almost as if they were preparing in advance for what's to come. In fact, Russia now has more gold than US dollars in its reserves, and China has increased its gold purchases since the market crash of 2020. And it is not only governments and central banks around the world who can see the writing on the wall, since some of the biggest and most renowned hedge fund managers in the world are also preparing for what's to come. For instance, Ray Dalio, the most successful hedge fund manager in the world with more than $140 billion in assets under management, famously said in an interview way back in 2019 that cash is trash. And every interview since then, he has been doubling down on his warnings. Even Warren Buffett, arguably the best investor of all times, has been warning investors since the turn of the last decade that the US dollar will continue losing value if the government continues on its reckless policies. He even said at one point that investors should avoid fixed dollar investments because they are bound to become worthless. Well, if you are like most people, I know you may be thinking that the US dollar losing its status as the world's reserve currency will probably not make any difference in your personal life. But unless you are part of the 1%, I'm sorry to say that you will be greatly impacted. For instance, the first thing that will happen in case the US dollar loses its reserve currency status is that the purchasing power of the average American will plummet. In fact, some even say that the middle class will be squeezed, and the difference between the haves and the have-nots will be greater than ever. After all, as the dollar becomes worth less, and nobody in the international markets accepts it anymore, its purchasing power will crater, thus making the prices of things like oil, energy, and other commodities skyrocket, all the while wages don't move at all, and then annihilating the poor and middle class as a result. To make matters worse, the economic machine could grind to a halt as a result of all of this economic mess. With hyperinflation, massive layoffs worse than what we saw during the coronavirus lockdowns, and millions of American families having to declare bankruptcy. Now, as central banks continue on their spending spree, you should be wise to ask what will replace cash. Today, there seems to be two reasonable alternatives. The first one being Bitcoin. Now, what makes Bitcoin so great is that it allows the integrity of the financial system to be maintained, since people will be able to trade at lightning-fast speeds even with no banks or middlemen involved. And not to mention that Bitcoin is completely decentralized. That is, no central power has control over it, and so no politician, government bureaucrat, or bad actor is able to implode the currency, just like what is happening with the US dollar. The only problem is that cryptocurrencies are not backed by any other reserve assets, and so some say that they are utterly worthless because of that. After all, one Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, and people only buy Bitcoin in hopes of selling it for more dollars than they bought. And that's why some people are confident that the world will revert back to the gold standard. That is, gold will become the default measure of value for all currencies, just like what happened throughout most of human history. The good thing about gold is that, unlike Bitcoin, there is intrinsic value and organic demand for it, since people all over the world still see gold as valuable because of its rare and unique properties. And since no government bureaucrat can control its supply, gold also cannot be manipulated, printed, or hyperinflated to the point of becoming worthless, thus allowing for a safe and solid financial system. Now, whether gold or crypto will be the future of money is still up for debate, but one thing is for certain: the future will be unlike anything we've ever seen, and those who can't see the writing on the wall and do not prepare for what's coming will be in trouble. So the central message of this video, more than trying to predict when the dollar will fall or what will replace it, is that you should be constantly looking to educate yourself and prepare for what's coming. Alright, you've just watched the end of the US dollar, how money will die. As you can see, things aren't likely to get better anytime soon for the average person. And if you want to survive and prosper in the coming years, you simply can't sit on your hands and hope that the government will fix everything for you. After all, they were the ones who created this mess to begin with. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think will be the future of money? Do you think the US dollar will still reign supreme, or other decentralized forms of money will replace it? Let me know in the comment section down below. And that's all for today's video. Thanks for watching, and until next time.